I'm really excited today to be able to introduce you to this incredible internationally certified coach. This man has clients all over the world. He's been doing it for 10 years. He has a following of over 113,000 on TikTok. This man's rapidly growing too. YouTube channel is phenomenal. He has an Instagram. He's most commonly known as the people displeaser, but his name is Nick Pollard. He also specializes in people pleasing. So today we're going to be talking about Thanksgiving, people pleasing, the holiday season, and the difficulties that come with this. So thank you so much for joining us, Nick.
It's my pleasure. Full disclosure, I kind of had a fanboy moment when you connected. So thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining on. Whenever I saw your videos, I was like, oh my God, this man has a brilliant mind. And I was so excited. I think it was like, what, 5 minutes before I was like, can I please have you on this podcast? Because what you have to say is so incredibly powerful. So I just feel so lucky to have you on today's episode.
Well, thank you. It comes from a long line of experiences of my own. So I'm grateful to be here.
All right. So I know a lot of people are really struggling this holiday season. So I wanted to start off by asking you, what do you see as the biggest struggle with people pleasers during the holiday season?
Probably, I think family creates problems. So if whether you come from a large or a small family, if you're a people pleaser, you didn't come from nowhere. And usually it's something that begins very early. And whether you're the peacekeeper or whether you have no boundaries or, whether you're just prone to overcommitment, it creates this, not necessarily a narrative, but then an environment that you can't thrive or think because you're at everyone else's mercy, and it makes you completely insane. So I think the biggest thing though is probably overcommitment.
Oh, yeah. Do you have any advice whenever it comes to overcommitment? Like, how do you navigate through that if you are constantly saying yes to everyone and afraid to disappoint someone?
So one of the more common things that I deal with my clients is you don't have a saying no problem. So this is very interesting because like they'll say, well, how do I learn to say no? It's not about learning how to say no. It's learning how not to say yes. Because if you say yes to everything, then your yes means nothing.
Mm.
Right. So one of the things you can start to do or that I instruct people to do in my coaching sessions is say no to everything for 5 days.
Ooh.
Literally everything. Whether it doesn't matter. I don't care what it is. Do you want to go? Even if you want to do it, say no. Because what you're trying to do when you're creating a new habit is you have to break into, a new frame of reference, and you have to learn that no isn't scary, number one. And then you have to actively practice how to do that. So when you do this for 5 straight days, people then get that it's kind of a goof, right? They think it's kind of a joke. So
Yeah.
it takes the pressure off, especially if you let people know.
Yeah.
But you're reprogramming your default yes to a no, because the principle I use in this way is like a no doesn't always mean no, because you can come back from a no, right? So if you think about an experience like where you said yes to somebody and then backed out, what was that like?
Ooh. I remember doing that. I would always feel so guilty.
You feel
That
like shit, right?
God, yeah.
Yeah. Well, imagine now a time when you've said no and then go back with a yes.
I mean, that feels a lot better. I'm not going
Right.
to deny that. It's like
Right.
surprise.
Right. A yes is incredibly hard to come back from, whereas
Mhm.
a no is not. So if you say yes and then go back on your word, because then you're not a person of your word,
Mm.
right? Then you suck. But if you say no and then change your mind, well, then you're a hero.
Oh, I like that. I like that. So I'm really curious. What advice would you give someone if they're being pressured by, let's just say, their spouse to go to a toxic in-laws house for Thanksgiving?
That's a tough one. So codependency and people pleasing have a tendency to run together. And if you're in that kind of codependent cycle, you have to start standing up for yourself. You have to realize that not even your spouse is entitled to like you all the time.
Ooh, that's powerful.
So, like, there are times that my girlfriend does things that make me insane. It
Mm.
doesn't mean I don't like her less, or I like her less. It just means that what she's doing is not something that I would prefer. And you have to understand that you aren't required to give yourself away to people. So while your spouse might prefer you do that, that preference is not your responsibility. So if somebody is truly toxic, and TikTok and social media now, everybody's toxic. I'm toxic, you're toxic, everybody's toxic. We're all toxic, everybody's a narcissist, everything sucks. But if somebody's truly narcissistic or truly just kind of shitty to you, and there's nothing you can do to move the needle on that,
Mhm.
my advice would be is, speak to your spouse very candidly and just say, look, I'm uncomfortable with this, and I realize that you would prefer that, but I don't want to resent you for having to go do that. And I also don't want to feel guilty if I don't. So there's that communication pattern that has to be broken where you're constantly giving yourself away, you know, and that comes back to saying yes and no. I mean, all of it's funny in the holidays. It's really about, your holiday matters too. Like who you are matters. Like I have Christmas traditions. My girlfriend has Christmas traditions. And then we kind of meld those things and we come up with our own traditions. And that's how it works. Well, if one of your Christmas traditions is going to your family's house and getting your ass kicked for Thanksgiving, don't do that. I know it seems simple. Like most of my advice is relatively simple. It's like, don't.
But I think it's really powerful advice because a lot of people they feel like they have to, even if they don't want to. Speaking on guilt, let's just build on that because there's a lot of people that struggle with guilt during the holiday season. I would love to know what are your thoughts on, let's just say like a parent or a grandparent. They want you to go to Thanksgiving dinner and they try to guilt you into it, like, I'm about to die. And they say like these kind of things that you're like, oh my God, you're right, but they're really unhealthy and just degrade you and they're just not nice.
Yeah, I think there's a delineation also that needs to be present, which is, are you experiencing guilt or are you experiencing FOMO? So a lot of people will say, well, I feel really guilty. Well, I think also there's a part of you that's afraid to be lonely, right? In those moments, and that's perfectly acceptable. Like that idea of guilt is funny because it's very much, without sounding crass, it's very much like a kidney stone. It'll pass. The problem with guilt is that you're experiencing a loss of preference again, which is, would you prefer to not have those conversations or not go to that thing? Yes. Well, you can decide in that moment whether the guilt trip is worth it, or you can just simply say the same thing, which is, look, I appreciate how much you want me to be there and I love you for that.
Mhm.
Right. I appreciate you. It's such a valuable tool. Like, I appreciate what you're saying. Again, I don't want to resent you for coming to do a thing that doesn't feel right to me, but I also can't accept your guilt for that. So when you're talking about these ideas around radical acceptance and transformation, you have to be really cognizant that like not everything is yours to accept. You don't have to accept their guilt, right? And when they give it to you, you can be like, well, they shouldn't do that. Well, that's whether they should or shouldn't is irrelevant. You would prefer that they don't, but they are.
Mhm.
So we accept that behavior and say, okay, I accept it. I no longer allow it, but I accept it.
I love that you said, I no longer allow it, but I accept it. And I think a lot of people they struggle with um the difference, like understanding the difference between allowing and accepting. So, do you mind just diving into that a little bit further and just explaining what is the difference for people
I,
that
th-
are confused?
I think I can do that best with a personal story. Um, so my father was a really unfortunately terrible human being,
Mhm.
and left me in a state that, I mean, I've said to you before that like I don't come from nowhere. This whole idea of people pleasing and addiction and all the things that I've battled through to be this person came from a place. Part of that place was through childhood trauma. So this was not a nice person, right? And for years, I tried to make him a nice person. Like I wanted that to be a thing. Once I accepted that he was who he was, then I was free to make choice. So acceptance actually allows choice. Okay, there's really only two things in your life that you can control. You can control your emotions, and you can control your actions. So your feelings are your responsibility, and your actions are your responsibility. Everything outside of that scope is kind of up for debate. So in that moment, I was like, okay, I can't control who he is. I can't control his actions. I can't control whether he takes responsibility or accountability for what he's done. Right. But I can now, through accepting that he is who he is, decide what level of influence he is allowed to have in my life. And that allowance was zero. When I backed away from that relationship, that was the ultimate form of acceptance. I cannot change this person. It's not my job to change this person. They will either be who they are supposed to be or they will not. Right. And then I'm like, okay, well, what does that mean? If they are choosing not to change, I can accept that as not my issue. What will I allow?
What are some feelings that you struggled with during that time?
Oh my God. Abandonment,
Mm.
fear, sadness. Um, there's a, you know, he was my best friend. So there was a profound sense of loneliness and loss. And I was terrified to be alive. And I think if I look back on my history, that's really where things got bad for me, was in that kind of late 2009, early 2010 timeframe where I was a mess. And um, wow, I haven't talked about that in a while. I wanted my dad, but he wasn't good for me. So it was time for me to disallow that influence and to make my own decisions and to become a better version of me. And it took me years. I mean, it took me almost a decade to get past it. I mean, it was 2018 when I decided to get sober. It was, and start the addiction battle, and I won, you know, which is awesome. And in that time frame too, it was like that's also when I started going, what is the idea that I have to make everybody happy all the time? And then once I figured that out, I was like, oh God.
What was something that you did to kind of pull you out of this dark place?
Again, it took years. Um, I didn't realize what was happening because I wasn't really that self aware at that time, right? But when things start to occur that are drastically, changing the framework of your life, everything starts to shift all at once. So at that point, I'm losing a marriage and trying to find a place to live, and everything kind of spirals when one thing goes, like when one big pillar falls, the rest of them end up toppling because there's an inherent weakness in the system at that point, right? So that pillar kind of was wiped away, and then I'm like, oh crap. And then so initially I dealt with it in the most toxic possible way. I just drank it till it went away. And then, over time, I'm like, okay, well, now my liver's starting to hurt. My brains are starting to get squishy, and I don't like who I'm becoming. So that's when I pulled the trigger in 18. I think the the biggest thing that I had to do though was to learn that focusing on myself and my needs was not selfish, it was required. Internally, you begin to wither and you begin to rot because you're not giving yourself what you need. And the world today, with social media and everything that you and I have been so successful at, is designed to make us think that everyone else either has it better or has the answers. And neither of those is true.
Wanted to ask you, if looking back at your life, right?
Hmm.
Everything you went through, and you were at the point of rock bottom. If you now could say some sort of advice to you in the past at rock bottom when you were at your lowest, what would that advice be?
It's one of the better coaching questions anybody's ever asked me. I think if I was to channel that young man that I was, and have done in the past, I would tell him it's okay, and that he would be okay, and that it was okay to hurt, it was okay to be afraid, and that we needed to slow down. But whether he did or whether he didn't, I would be there waiting for him at the
Oh, I love that. Wow. Oh my God, that I would be there waiting for me. This is just beautiful and so powerful. It really is. It really is. So thank you for sharing such a vulnerable, intimate thing with us. I think a
end.
lot.
I didn't know we were going to go there, but
I didn't know we were going to go there either. I love it. I love it. I'm so grateful that you were willing to be open and honest and raw with us. We need more of that in this world. We really do. So I know that was, a little bit off topic of Thanksgiving and all of that, but I think it was so needed. It really was. Um, let's go right back to Thanksgiving though, because I know a lot of people listening to this episode, they really want to know like how to navigate through this holiday season. So
sure.
and not just for Thanksgiving, just any holiday, really. So
Hmm.
I just wanted to know, what are some things you can do? Like let's just say you're at Thanksgiving dinner or at Christmas dinner
Hmm.
or whatever dinner it may
Sure.
be, and your relative that you've already set boundaries with, you're like, hey, I don't want to talk about politics, or I don't want to talk about having children, or whatever it may be. And this person keeps crossing the line with your boundaries. They just keep pushing it. So what do you do in that case?
I think there's two things. First, boundary communication happens in stages.
Mhm.
And I think there's this, pop psychology's put together this idea that, once you communicate a boundary, everybody's just supposed to bow to you. Well,
Mhm.
that's horseshit, and that's not going to work. So the first thing is that if you haven't been actively practicing your boundaries and you don't actively know how to communicate them, then part of that what you're probably experiencing is that people still don't know what they are, right? And there's a component to that you shouldn't accept abuse no matter what, right? But also, it is your responsibility to manage your own triggers. I've mentioned, now that I've had a relatively rough past, and I can be triggered very easily. But I've had to figure out that my triggers are my responsibility, right? So that's part of it. You have to understand whether it's somebody's actually passing a boundary or whether they're just triggering you. So, which is a big delineation. The second part of that is if you've communicated the boundary, you are responsible for its enforcement. So if, let's say, you're at a boundary, they say a thing that you don't like and they say it all the time, they're just kind of jabbing at you, leave.
Yeah.
I know that's the simplest answer ever. But so often we overlook the answer because it's the scariest possible answer. I don't tolerate my family well at all. So that said, when they do what they do, I generally will just walk away from the situation. You have to. So there's a couple of components to that too. When you're thinking about like Thanksgiving dinner is a great example. You need to have an exit strategy at all times, especially if you have somebody within a toxic family structure as well. Like I have an exit strategy always.
Now, what does an exit strategy look like for you, or some ideas that you can give people that are listening right now?
Don't ride with anybody. Take your own vehicle or transport yourself to and from however you need to. Don't drink if you're driving. An exit strategy doesn't have to be verbal. It can just be, I'm choosing to depart the situation because I am feeling that you are not understanding the rules to engage here, right? That's simple and easy. Like if somebody's, the other thing is that people have a tendency to drink at holiday parties and Thanksgiving. And this is why, like, I don't know how many people that know Thanksgiving is just basically fight night, but that's what most people see. We're all going to get together. We're all going to have too much wine. We're all going to eat until we're miserable. And then we're all going to yell at each other. That is what Thanksgiving is for most people. It's the least thankful thing we do all year long. But then we blame the fucking holiday.
That's
Like it's the holiday's fault. Well, it's Thanksgiving's fault. No, your family sucks and you all got drunk.
But it's so true.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. So it was funny. Like when I stopped drinking, I stopped having holiday problems.
Oh,
Mhm.
okay.
Yeah. And, albeit there's the occasional glass of wine, here and there in my future, but I won't drink around any of my family ever, not ever again. I don't see the value in putting a substance in my system that is inherently depressing. So alcohol's funny because it's built to have fun with, like it's built to enhance your life, right? So it brings down your walls, lowers your inhibitions, makes things a little bit more fun. Um, Great until it isn't, right? Because then when your inhibitions come down, especially if you're a people pleaser, this is really interesting. You've been burying your emotions for decades. So if I lower the gate to those emotions, what do you think is going to happen? You've had them walled up in this little prison for the last, let's say you've been burying one little, you know, your mom said maybe you should have a baby, right? She's really, not really pushing, but she said it once like 6 months ago and it irritated you, but you didn't say anything. When do you think that's coming out? Thanksgiving dinner when you've had 5 glasses of wine? Probably so. Remember, to be uninhibited is not a good idea around toxic people. Don't do that.
I do want to ask you something and just kind of dive into something that, especially if you're really struggling with people pleasing, you feel horrible about
Hmm.
certain things, even just hurting someone's feelings or making the wrong step. You're constantly walking on eggshells, right? So let's just say
Right.
your dad, grandpa, whoever, they ask you a question and you instantly become really uncomfortable. You don't want to answer the question. So how do you navigate through that in a healthy way?
I think it depends on the question. So if it's a question like that, that you've asked them to not get engaged with, right? You can simply just say, I choose not to answer that question. If you want to be kind of playful about it and jab back, say, under the advice of counsel, I've chosen not to answer that line of questioning.
Oh, I love that.
But if somebody asks you a truly profoundly awful question, it's okay to be really challenging. And the way that I usually will do that is I look them like eyeball to eyeball, and you may be able to tell that I have an intense set of features, and that happens to be here. Um, and if I look at somebody and go, "Are you okay?" That's usually enough.
I love that. I love that. Just looking at someone and being like, are you okay? When it comes to asking just a really highly offensive question. Because,
Mhm.
grandpa or grandma gets a little too
Yeah.
much of that good inside of their system and they start going
Hmm.
on those questions,
Right. And that's the big questions, the crazy ones, like when are you going to get married, especially if you're, they don't ask boys that as much, but they do have a tendency to ask women that. And, that's one of the ones that I've seen a lot of in my clients, like, how do I answer this around Christmas? Well, first communicate the boundary that you don't want to talk about it. And if they do it again, just straight up ask them, are you okay? Because I feel like we've talked about this.
Mm.
Right. Not everybody's going to be nearly as intense as I am. I'm a 200 pound, you know, gorilla of a human. So I'm probably more imposing than a lot of people, but the, the point still remains is that you can bring anger to a conversation and you can allow that to be real. And I think one of the problems with people pleasers is they don't like to think that they're angry, but they're usually incredibly angry human beings. To allow that to come through the eyes more than anything else is very important. And you know how to look angry. Like if I say look angry right now, can you do it? Oh, yeah, there it is. Just like,
I'm very good at acting, but
right.
I'm squinting my eyes as hard as I can.
Right. So if you're watching or you're listening to this, what I would say to you is like right now, if I say be angry, imagine how you feel in your eyeballs. And that's how I want you to say that. Are you okay? It's a record scratch, is all
I
you're
love
doing.
the record scratch, but what if you say, are you okay? And then the person says, yeah, why are you avoiding the question? What do you do in that case?
Because I've communicated to you the case that I don't want to have that discussion. And it seems like maybe you forgot.
Ooh, that's a great response. That's a good one.
Right. So the other one that I love that one. That one actually came from my girlfriend came up with that one. But the other one that where we go back to the politics because my brain just did that thing is I don't discuss religion, politics, or money with my family.
Mhm.
You can use that just as a statement. I don't discuss religion, politics, or money with my family.
Oh, I like that. And that
Right.
can also help, if someone comes up and maybe they're someone that you strongly disagree with
Hmm.
their views, just letting them know that
Right.
and just saying that with firm, the angry eyes. I love that. You can say that firm. You don't have to be mean, but you can be firm. And I think a lot of people struggle with the difference between being mean and just being firm.
Right. Well, and that's a huge misconception among that people pleaser identity is that, well, if I stop being people pleaser, then I stop being a dick. No, you start being kind and start being assertive.
Mm.
Your voice matters just as much as anybody else's, and you just have to get used to the idea that you're not so like another kind of common thing in our socioeconomic system is that everybody thinks that we're supposed to be happy all the time. By what margin? Where did that come from? Like misery is part of living. Like suffering is part of living. If you look at the Stoics, if you look at even Viktor Frankl, we talk about finding purpose, finding meaning through misery, through that suffering. So part of suffering is understanding that you can't control everything, and not everybody's supposed to be happy with you all the time either. So are you going to make people upset? Yeah, man. Like people ask me all the time, well, what if they get mad? Let them. Oh no, what are they going to burn your house down? Relax. It's not going to be, most of the things that we think are massive problems we inflate because we don't want to deal with the actual issue,
Mhm.
especially and this about emotions too, especially in your work with breakups, like you inflate the problem so you don't have to deal with what actually the problem is because you make it so big that it's insurmountable, when in actuality it's this little bitty thing that you just don't want to deal with because you're scared.
Fear really can hold a lot of people back, can't it?
Right. It just but let people be mad at you. I'd rather them be mad at me. I would rather have 5 people that think I'm awesome than 20 people who just kind of like me.
Well, I mean, a lot of people just want to be liked by everyone, and that's impossible. That's literally, someone will find something, even in the way that you move your lips or the way you blink, like they'll
Right.
find, if they want to find something, they will.
Absolutely.
What are some other things that you should just avoid during Thanksgiving dinner to help maintain peace?
It's hard to say because I think it's subjective, but the biggest piece of advice I can give you is let's say, pretend for a second that you're watching this and you do or do not have a drinking problem. Either one doesn't matter. If I'm you and you're me, avoid alcohol at Thanksgiving. If you have a glass of wine, fine, but don't do much more than that. The reason is because, again, we're talking about an inhibition lowering. Um, it takes away, also, it reduces your scope, your vision scope down to now. So it eliminates the future. That's why you see people doing so much dumb shit when they drink, is because they don't see a future. Because it just puts this wall up and you're like, now is now. Yay, FOMO. And you do dumb shit, right? Well, that dumb shit also includes mean shit. It also includes speaking your mind out of turn. It also means, um, you know, overreactions. It means, fights with family. It can mean all kinds of things in the context of people pleasing, because these people are burying their emotions for decades. It's usually not like 10 minutes that they've been a people pleaser and they call me on the phone or they're watching this podcast. It's a pretty long timeline where they're going, oh my God, this is impacting my life.
Mhm.
And that's where I think the rubber meets the road for people is like, don't drink if you can avoid it. Don't discuss politics if you can avoid it. Don't talk about money if you can avoid it. Don't talk about religion if you can avoid it. There have been rules like this in society for decades and decades and decades, right? My parents didn't talk about money, politics, or religion around family. Now, my parents were also my parents, but if you look at, I was raised in the 90s. I look at the 80s, I look at the 70s, I look at the 60s. Well, they learned that behavior from somewhere, right? It's only since the advent of social media have people started to really talk about politics with their family, right? And for years, that was the standard. Why? Because it's more important to have a happy relationship with people than it is to be right. And I think what people are missing is, I would rather do what's right than be right.
Speaking of grandpa, grandma, all of these people in the family, there are some people that they don't have family to go to for
Yeah.
Thanksgiving. They're completely alone. So what is something that you can give, if you could just give them advice on how to navigate through this holiday season, if that's your case, what would that advice be?
I'd like to go to another story about that. Last Christmas, I was in Panama, and I was I was supposed to be with somebody at that time, and I was not, and ended up spending Christmas alone. But there's this weird thing that I think we have forgotten societally, which is people like to connect, and there are other people with no one. There's a moment where you have to think about it. And I had to have this moment with myself. It was Christmas Eve. And I knocked on my neighbor's door. He's a Canadian guy, and really nice human. And I'm like, "Hey, what are you doing today?" I knew he was alone. And he was like, "Actually, I'm going up to a party at this place. Do you want to go?" And I was like, "Sure." He's like, "You got to run over there and get a present for the white elephant thing." I'm like, "Okay, fine." So I ran over and I did that. And the next thing I know, I'm at a Christmas Eve party. Oh, okay. Well, the day before, I had been out on his boat with his friends, and I had met 2 people that I ended up caring about very much and actually became clients, which was funny. And then on Christmas Day, they had invited me up for breakfast. So I went up and I had breakfast, right?
Mhm.
So I think what people are missing is that they think that there's like this finite opportunity to connect with other people. You have to create these opportunities. And I remember the day before I went out on the boat with my buddy. Um, and by the way, I'm in paradise at this point. Like, like the clear blue Caribbean water was absolutely absurd. There's no reason I should have been sad, right? According to the normal idea of living. And I was just alone, and I was sad, and I was a little lonely, and it's fine. Well, I just woke up one day, and I do this thing in the morning where I write who I want to be that day on the mirror, like things that I'm trying to improve or whatever. I still do it to this day. I write down who I'm going to be. And then one of the things that I was kind of talking to the universe. I don't really do the God thing, but I'm a universalist, and what I heard was just say yes today. Just yes. The answer is yes. You have nobody to say no to, so just say yes. My family's all in Denver, and um, you know, scattered to the four winds. And I'm like, okay, fine. Well, I'm just going to say yes. Well, I go downstairs, and my buddy Dustin's like, hey, do you want to go out on the boat? I said no. Absolutely not. I do not want to do that. Like, I'm depressed. I'm sad. I'm lonely. I'm like, okay, so I walk up the stairs, and I hear myself in my head. I'm like, okay, so you're depressed because you're sad and you're lonely. And you just said no to not being lonely. And I'm like, oh, wow, you dummy. So I called Dustin. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to come out of the boat. So I go out of the boat, fast forward, right? So the point I make is um, find an opportunity to connect, right? It sounds cliched, but volunteer to soup kitchen. Um, go to your local Denny's and sit with somebody who doesn't have a friend. You know, there are people that are going to be alone. Find them and be the other person that's alone, because two people alone are not alone. You have to be okay with getting uncomfortable because it's going to be uncomfortable, right? So you have to decide which uncomfort is worse, or which discomfort is worse. Is it worse to sit alone and lament, or is there more power in being proactive and doing something about it? And I chose to be proactive and do something about it.
Yeah, that's really, really powerful. And I think that's going to help so many people, especially people that are struggling this holiday season with trying to figure out, well, what can I do? And that's an incredible idea, to be able to volunteer or sit with someone at Denny's. And God, that could make a world of difference. Because imagine if you're sitting at Denny's alone, and then this person walks up to you and is like, hey, I'd love to sit with you. And how much would
Mhm.
that mean? And the impact, you would think about that years to come. The smallest act of kindness can create a lifelong impact. And
Absolutely.
you know, you want to live forever. Well, you can live forever in someone's memory if you're kind to them. All right. So we did run out of time for this podcast today, but I know so many of my listeners and viewers, they're going to want to know where to find you. So where can we find you on social media?
Um, TikTok is my main platform. Obviously, I'm trying to grow my Instagram account. I just neglected it because because I like TikTok better, I think. But if you find me on Instagram, it's at the People Displeaser. On TikTok, it's People Displeaser, and I think that's actually consistent across the rest of the platforms, whether it's Facebook or YouTube. It's just People Displeaser. Um, and then you can actually Google me as Nick Pollard People Pleaser, and you'll find me as well. Um, so that's the best ways.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode and giving us such profound advice that I know is going to make an impact in so many people's lives. So thank you for
Thank
that.
thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Well, I really truly enjoyed it. So be sure to tune in for the next episode. We'll be covering other topics. And I really appreciate you guys all taking the time to listen to this podcast. And I look forward to seeing you guys in the future.